firstly, let's just extend our applause and congratulations to the team for making this far. The second thing is that there's a large crowd and it's a nice spacious room, but you can also hear your voices. So if possible, actually, like it should be possible, please try to keep discussions to a minimum. If you wish to leave the room, please do so in between speeches and make sure your phones are silent or off. In opening government, we have UT Mara A. In opening opposition, we have NUS All. In closing government, we have IIUM. And in closing opposition, we have PACA. And Luke to my left, handling with me is Leroy from UM. Yeah. Alex from Help. To my right is Amrit from Taylor, Alice from UM, Dave from Taylor, Patrick from UM. Alright, the motion is this House believes that we should refrain from characterizing villains in history as monsters. With that, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
She's proud! She'll set your kids on fire! Azalea! Azalea!
Right. Okay. Mr. Speaker, so who do we see as monsters, right? So let me characterize a few things before I go on into my positive substantives, right? So monsters, in a context of history, are people that we describe as evil, right? Due to their evil acts, and they defy human logic for that matter itself, right? Which means that we put them on a pedestal, that there's some kind of level of exceptional person that goes beyond what's human, right? So which means that the fact that we call Hitler for that matter, so we characterize him as disgusting. So we some exclusive evil human being, right? So what does this mean? It makes him, you make these depictions like they're likely to be so you make these depictions likely to be processed by the public as something that's larger than life, right? So it's something exaggerated. So which is why, one, we should then refrain from doing so, and also that it enables society to then have a evaluated and sober evaluation of history in of itself, right? So what do we mean by refraining? One, we refrain from using phrases like evil, like monstrous for that matter, right? Anything that then attaches extraordinary labels to these people. And secondly, we will then not employ bombastic description of how evil these people are to then create deterrence at the end of the day, right? So also, you then make people to then cause deterrence and also to then make people feel guilt at the end of the day, right? So, for example, as opposed to saying Hitler has brutally murdered millions of people for the sake of conquest, we then now change it to Hitler caused death of millions, right? Now, why we think this is absolutely important. Now, onto my arguments, two things I'm bringing to my speech today. First, what is this information likely to look like when you attempt to characterize something as monstrous? Second thing, no thank you. How I'm going to tell you how it lowers people's views on this ordinary factors, right? First, what is this information likely to look like, right? So, few things. First, language that utilizes words like evil, for that matter, that attaches extraordinary factors or characteristics to this person. One, it creates larger than life perception, right? Like Hitler is some kind of god, for that matter, to have created this type of things, to have killed millions of people, instead of us actually realizing that the problems to the millions of deaths, no thank you, are actually due to normal things, right? Like poverty, for that matter, or poverty, for that matter, or nationalists, right? So it also means, second, on how that kind of language makes them seem as out of ordinary. Now, why is this all really important, right? Now, this is all really important because then it prevents us from then carefully assessing why these villains come to power, one, and why these atrocities come at the end of the day, right? Let's look at genocide for that matter, right? Now, genocide is probably caused by one thing, by a few things. But one of the reasons is because of poverty in Europe after the World War, right? So look at Hitler and the Nazi Party, right? It came into power. On how that happened is because of normal nationalist party, right? So not extraordinary factors like your side of the house wanted to paint this thing as, right? So we have to be vigilant about this, right? So these villains are byproducts of these normal circumstances, right? Not out of the ordinary circumstances, right? But also labeling, you then draw attention to the individual. So it seems like you're saying genocide is due to this one person instead of probably the byproduct of poverty, right? So it seems like something that probably wouldn't be able to happen in the 21st century because Hitler is dead, which doesn't make sense at the end of the day, right? So let's look at, so now when you have all these sober discussions, one, people are then forced to acknowledge the reasons behind these atrocities. No, thank you. Second, people are now able to analyze the root of these problems, right? Not these larger-than-life leaders we paint them as, right? So on your side of the house, you will not be able to recognize or acknowledge or learn from your mistakes at the end of the day, due to the fact that because these monsters are probably no more in the 21st century, so probably genocide are not likely to materialize. Sure, closing.
So would you go as far as positively portraying the i.e. he was a great artist, he was trying to stop the economic exploitation of the Jews?
No. No. Anyway, so second thing, let's look at how it lowers people's things to how these ordinary factors then leads up to these instances, right? So we tell you that things are parties like neo-Nazis or KKK, right? Now, why is this really important, right? When liberal people will point out that this is how Hitler came to power, right? In the 21st century, things like KKK or what's been happening in the society now are similar to how Hitler came into power. Now, so what do I mean by this? Then people would then make fun of them. Now, why is this so, right? So because then for you to make a comparison to an atrocity that's so dire to a person, to an idol, to just Hitler is just harmful and weird, right? It's just really funny when someone compares this huge genocide to Hitler. Now, I think, why is this so? Again, you don't then self-reflect on your side of the house, right? So, reasons why Hitler, for example, how Hitler came into power. Because of poverty, nationalism, and anti-Semitism, right? So when Hitler is placed, so for example, like Hitler placed his men near a ballot box, right? Now this is something as normal as people rigging the ballot, right? This is something that's not out of the ordinary. Normal circumstances that's happening right now that we do not want to acknowledge due to the fact that Hitler's not alive. So we think that, hey, something as crazy as what's happened in Hitler's time wouldn't happen again, right? So on our side, coming from side, opening government, we tell you that these things wouldn't, we don't want these things to then repeat itself again. And we think it's actually important for us to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for his speech. I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition.
Testing. Testing. Is this better? Yeah, because once upon a time in Asian semi-final, I was told that I didn't know how to use the mic. So, I mean, to be fair, the guy who told me that was top speaker of Asian. So, I guess he's right. Okay, great, perfect. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, good. I think the bulk of the OG's case centers upon the idea that if we label people like Hitler, Mao, and Stalin or Pol Pot as monsters, we ignore structural factors that result in them rising to power in the first place. That's not necessarily the case, right? Let me explain why. Firstly, just because they used ordinary means in order to achieve power does not mean that the outcomes themselves were ordinary. The outcomes of their actions were extraordinary, and even if you had ordinary motivations like poverty, and you were aided by ordinary democratic processes or by ordinary people who help you get into power, the outcomes are extraordinary, and the consequences of your legacy are what define you as a monster in the first place. Furthermore, so it's an analogy to like basically, it's not just about intent when you convict you of the severity of a crime, right? The point is, even if you didn't intend to kill the person, if you ended up killing the person, that crime itself is significantly more grievous than if you had just caused them like a slight bit of harm. Secondly, though, I think blaming structural factors primarily suggests to us that there is no X factor, that the world is determinist. If we can measure general trends of history and of societies, that it is inevitable that things will happen, as opposed to human beings, and particular human beings that are entrusted with significant amounts of power, like being capable of free will and great evil. The fact is that side-opening government will underestimate the importance of free will of great leaders and individuals in being capable of committing great evil, and that is something that I'll be talking about in my substantive argument later on, when we have to watch out for these things. Last but not least, even if these other structural factors are important, does it change the fact that they are monsters? Does it change the fact that we can learn from these individuals from their rise to power regardless? Like scholarship on World War II, on the rise of Hitler, of Mao, and of Stalin has been fairly extensive. We acknowledge them as being monsters, but we've also learned what it means for Hitler's party to subvert democratic processes, burn down the Reichstag and blame it on other parties, and generally use underhanded means of achieving power in Germany. We're not blind to these lessons, and we are better prepared for these lessons in the future, despite the fact that we still label Hitler as a monster. So what then is the actual case, right? So I honestly think that OG's, like government's strongest argument is to portray evil as being banal, as Arendt would call it, right? That ordinary people are capable of great evil, rather than structural factors aiding in the creation of such evil. Here's my problem. I've got two main arguments as to why, even if you believe that ordinary people are capable of great evil, the villains of history that we're going to talk about, like Pol Pot, were exceptionally evil, not merely in the outcomes, but also in the personalities of such individuals, and why it means we have to watch out for these things in the future. First argument, which doesn't deal so much with personalities, but with outcomes. How we condemn evil to a greater degree, rather than actually apologizing for such evil. Because even if, in many instances, we don't take lesser acts of evil seriously, we often turn a blind eye to ethnic cleansing, we turn a blind eye to civil wars. There are some classes of crimes, like genocide, which we cannot afford to turn a blind eye to. There are some classes of crimes that we have to label as the apex of what it means for humans to be evil. Because the alternative on OG is that no one is a monster or that everyone is a monster. I don't think they will say that everyone is a monster. They'll probably say that no one is a monster. And it means we conflate like lesser acts of evil, which, as regrettable as they are, we often try to find ways to justify, versus greater acts of evil, which we ought not to turn a blind eye to. We conflate them, we ignore them. We ignore them, we get another Rwanda. Simple as that. More importantly, it's also not about giving like apologists ammunition to justify certain elements of these individuals' legacy. If you say Hitler was an ordinary person, or Stalin was an ordinary person with ordinary motivations, who was capable of great evil and was aided by structural factors, you allow apologists the chance to use elements of Hitler's legacy to try and justify his legacy. Like Hitler built autobahns for the people. Hitler's actually an ordinary person who loves animals. No, thank you. All of these things which dilute our ability to condemn such great acts of evil and speak out against villains of history, especially when they have implications of whether we can identify such evil in the future. Last but not least, under this first argument, we don't want countries to try to rehabilitate images, the image of former monsters to suit their own purposes. A huge-ass portrait of Mao Zedong still stands outside the Forbidden Palace. And often, unlike Russia, which condemned Stalin, unlike Germany, which condemned Hitler, China still uses Mao Zedong's legacy as a means of justifying their rule. They paint Mao Zedong as someone who united China, and for all the sacrifices and mistakes that the Chinese Communist Party made, that still means that the Chinese Communist Party, which is Mao's legacy, has the right to rule. That is not something we can countenance unless we say outright that Mao Zedong was indeed a monster. Now, does our policy actually mean that we're going to change China? Of course not, right? But the alternative is that things will be far easier for countries like China to continue using their images to maintain a grip on power, as opposed to building up opposition movements to these leaders and to their legacies. Sharif.
Don't you make Chinese people more emotionally invested at the point where you call Mao Zedong a monster?
I mean, that works under the assumption that we never called them a monster in the first place in some parts of the world, like China, and people outside call them monsters, and that's why the tension happens, right? So it's a bit circular, right? The point is, we regret the fact that he was not called a monster in China in the first place. Second major argument on how we identify evil. So firstly, we have to identify evil in ourselves. I think the human mind has a wonderful capacity to justify a lot of the nonsense we do to other people. And if we don't label certain acts of genocide as outright evil, and that it paints you as a monster, we find it very easy to slip into the ability to justify, oh, we did this for the right reason, or it was an honest mistake, and we therefore don't check ourselves as much. People like Winston Churchill, who should never have allowed 3 million Indians to starve during World War II because he redirected food from the Indians to the British war effort. We need to call him out as a monster too, because otherwise we just say, oh well, part of Churchill's legacy was good, right? He saved Britain, he saved the free world. We can ignore all that other shit. No, that is why the word monster exists. Maybe the Americans won't call Churchill a monster. I bet you a lot of Indians would. We also need to look for evil in other people when we identify similarities between unique classes of monsters versus ordinary evil people, right? I'm not a fan of Najib or Suharto or people from I'm kidding. But there is a unique class of monsters that are not Najibs, not Suhartos, and not whoever whom we need to identify. And if only we had well-known, famous examples to draw parallels to, it is a lot easier for us to call out these figures before it's too late. That's why you should vote opening up.
And you leader of opposition now, let's call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
He's a man of fun, he's a man of style. Big stars, big stars.
I think the opening opposition is negligent in the sense that they don't recognize that Suharto, and I'm not going to say the other name, are, if left unchecked, ladies and gentlemen, very easily, very quickly fall into the same vein of the most exceptionally dangerous regimes and villains in history. And let's not forget that these things are not singular entities led by one charismatic figure, and that's why these things persisted and harmed so many people. They were institutional. They were things that seeped into society. There were everyday acts of every German buying into that rhetoric, reporting on the apparent Jewish person that lived next door. It was seeped into the fact that they were willing to vote for a party that was explicitly anti-Semitic because they promised economic gain after the World War, ladies and gentlemen. These are the everyday evils that we need to be more vigilant of, that don't get crowded out and also blindsided by when we talk about monstrous figures that dominate headlines, dominate discourse, and fundamentally crowd out our discussion about the everyday evils of the everyday man. First thing is, I'm going to talk about, are we able to have assessments of what is evil if we don't call something monstrous, ladies and gentlemen? Because that's the fundamental assumption of the opening opposition. Because we think that if you have the descriptions that Azalea provided, like for example, Hitler killed millions of people, versus Hitler was a brutal murderer who, in his evil pursuits, and also because he's the child of darkness apparently, pursued a challenge of trying to eradicate all Jews from earth, and this is someone that we should condemn because he is an exceptional evil in the world. The kind of bombastic language, ladies and gentlemen, makes a difference in this particular circumstance when it comes to us, what we focus on, but we can still condemn something as being bad and evil under our side of the house. Nothing they say makes that mutually exclusive in this particular debate. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, notice that us evaluating good versus bad, or evaluating something is, like for example, the Nazi regime being horrible to people, for example, doesn't require us to focus on the individualistic aspect of whether or not Hitler was a monster or not. So we can describe the Nazi regime as being something that killed millions of people, something that caused massive amounts of pain, without drawing focus to the cult of personality that is Hitler in this particular circumstance. We think this is an important distinction, because individualized rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, is what distracts people from the structural investigations of why things happen in the status quo. And that's specifically what Adil clashed with us on in this particular debate. We think that was really important. Okay, great. Second, ladies and gentlemen, so which means that the first clash of whether we need to be abolished or not is not the contention in this particular debate. Second is, first, what we want to talk about is also why it draws focus away from all the structural factors that we wanted to concern ourselves with. When you focus on the individual and how monstrous he was, ladies and gentlemen, notice what Azalea's characterization, which was never challenged by Adil, was that using the bombastic language of describing someone as a monster, ladies and gentlemen, also draws focus to their personality, to the cult of personality. Makes it seem larger than life, ladies and gentlemen. Makes it seem like an extraordinary evil beyond what is reasonably possible of every reasonable, rational human being in the status quo. We cannot imagine that somewhere in this room another Hitler might exist, ladies and gentlemen, because we cannot imagine a Hitler existing in our midst. That is someone so evil, ladies and gentlemen. That's why most of the pop culture references we have to Hitler focus on things like, we popularize things like the distribution of Mein Kampf, for example, ladies and gentlemen, his personal writing. Things like, we analyze how he was brought up, the kind of abuse he went through as a child, whether or not he was a Catholic, what his personal religion was, whether or not he went to art school, as closing opposition points to it. All these personalized rhetoric, ladies and gentlemen, focus onto the individual because it allows us to find a quick answer to people who are craving for an explanation as to why an atrocity happened in the past, ladies and gentlemen. And those quick answers come in making rash personality profiles on these particular individuals to explain away why those things occur, and most importantly, not take personal responsibility over why certain atrocities happen. It is secondly very hard for individuals to be able to take responsibility over why atrocities happen on a structural level, to take responsibility, for example, that vast majority of German people voted for the Nazi party in Asia, because it recognizes and forces them to admit that they were complicit in the fact that there's something like that happened in the status quo. That means if history focuses on the fact that the individual was evil, that the individual was exceptional, it is a lot easier for everyone, ladies and gentlemen, to pawn off responsibility to the individual exception as opposed to take responsibility and interrogate your beliefs and interrogate why those structural reasons occurred. We think that comparatively, although we don't get the sex appeal of being able to tout the evil actors of the world, being able to paint them as vaudeville villains and be able to make movies out of them, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, ladies and gentlemen, people cannot scapegoat exceptions in society and claim that those things will never occur again, like Azala told you in her speech. Yes.
Which one do you think is going to be more likely to make people question what they are doing and watch out what they are doing? The idea that they are complicit in evil, or the idea that they are simply victims of circumstance?
If people say that, look, it's a catch-22. We understand it's going to be difficult for people to hold themselves accountable in this particular scenario. But is the alternative preferable in your world? Are you going to make them take accountability for anything on your side of the house? Because like we say, the overwhelming narrative is that you will pawn off every responsibility towards this individual as opposed to take some semblance of responsibility on our side. Our worst case scenario is at least, even though some people might be reluctant, more people, at least on our side, are able to structurally analyze and are less distracted by the cults of personality are created as a result of these depictions and focuses on the monstrosities in this circumstance. You can't place a nirvana fallacy on us and not prove the alternative is working on your side of the house. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's also important that placing this exception as a predominant description also means we can't call out all the structural failures on your side of the house. Every time we try to call out, something is being edging towards dictatorships, edging towards a villain of society. People say we are ridiculous, we are exaggerating, we are dramatizing, we are PC police, and we are individuals. They're just trying to, when there are Nazis and KKK in American streets, and people are saying, this might lead to Nazism, and this might lead to another Hitler, people say, of course not, you're exaggerating. Because the cult of personality is beyond imagination, beyond human imagination that it could be in our midst, ladies and gentlemen. And that particular circumstance, evil is in all of us. Do we have the bravery to confront that reality? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. To close the closing half of the debate, I like to call upon every leader of
Nice try.
Testing. No sound. Hello? No. Hello? Hello? Okay. All right. Simply not using the term monster does not erase the abstraction of evil from the minds of individuals who consume the information. All that it actually says is that everything and every atrocity that was committed in history does not qualify for the individual to be called a monster yet. We think that's inherently pernicious. The first question I want to ask is whether or not these individuals do deserve the term of monster, and why is it that it's important that we label them as such. Recognize that on opening government, they were very convenient in terms of saying that there were many factors that led to the rise of these individuals. But what they don't want to deal with is the fact that sometimes a single individual can have a lot of power in terms of determining what happens and why the atrocity even occurred in the first place. So for instance, if you look at Duterte in the Philippines, he single-handedly ran on a platform and ordered for the killings of like millions or thousands of people on the ground, and he's single-handedly able to do that because he's able to wrest control of the reins of power and therefore make everyone fearful of not listening to his orders. The truth of the matter is that these individuals are personally responsible for a lot of the atrocities that take place, and we need to deal with it as such. But the second thing that I want to note is that I don't really believe, or I don't think you should believe, what opening government says about how personal responsibility being dealt with these individuals means that you don't think this problem will ever happen again. The way that human beings perceive of monsters is the idea that monsters are everywhere, they are hiding among us, and we must do everything that we can to stop them from being able to rise to power. That is the reason why we think outside is much better in terms of preventing the precise atrocities that they are talking about, because we think that the emotional impact, the visceral impact of evil is incredibly important. Many bad things happen in the world. Many of them are results, or like many bad things that happen are a spectrum of bad things that happen. But we must be able to draw the line and draw the standard and say that some things are just too monstrous that they are actually evil. We need to watch out for these things. Simply saying that everything's a spectrum of evil does not allow individuals to internalize and actually look out for the signs of those evil happening, because they just constantly think that they are on that spectrum and that they're not going to go towards the worst portion. The idea of evil is something that everybody absolutely wants to avoid because it is something that cannot be justified under any scenario. And we think that's a specifically important way to deal with it. So why was it very convenient for opening government? On the one hand, they tell us that now people are going to take personal responsibility, which they wouldn't otherwise because they are pawning it off on the individual at hand. If that is really how people are like, then please explain to me why is it that simply blaming on circumstances will not make people also pawn that same personal responsibility off onto the fact that they were victims of circumstance and therefore were like unwitting like members to the fact they actually allowed for these kinds of atrocities to happen. I think a more likely scenario is that given that people have an instinctive aversion to the emotional idea of calling someone a monster, they are much more likely to be afraid of being seen as complicit to that evil, that the emotional reaction to themselves is one in which they are much more likely to look out for those signs of evil because they don't want those kinds of tragedies to happen to them anyway. The fact or the idea of simply calling everything a spectrum or everything is simply being called a circumstance does not aid in that particular outcome, because it means that people are willing to accept all of the little evils that at the end of the day build up towards becoming the great evil that you talk about. So on your side of the house, if we agree that many bad things happen on a spectrum, but you don't actually tell people which part of the spectrum is considered unacceptable, that's when you create the circumstance in which many like gray areas exist in the world about abrogation of human rights in the interest of some sort of greater goal become seen as acceptable and are not seen to be steps they are being taken towards eventually reaching the absolute evil. Yes, Miss.
So why don't we have history books that analyze the fact that all these structural factors led to the Third Reich, that led to the millions of deaths and the election of Hitler, but drawing to the individualism and the cult of personality around Hitler as an individual?
Right, so the thing is that history books do teach you all these things. They tell you how the evil eventually rose into power and all these signs that you need to look out for when it comes to the evil being drawn, being put up and being placed into power. The problem is, if you're not willing to say that this individual, at the point at which he ended up in power, did something that was absolutely evil, that cannot be justified, you don't have that same emotional impact on individuals who are then, who are then less likely to believe that these are things that are absolutely bad and that ought to be avoided. So I think that this idea that is a simple, like clear dichotomy between ever explaining the structural factors and not is like untrue, right? You can still explain the structural factors that existed that allowed for these people to rise up into power. But the point here is whether or not you call that person a monster for what that person has done and the kind of bad things that they have done from there as well. No. Next question, next thing that we want to talk about is what are the actual impacts of this particular portrayal of this individual in what the effects of this particular portrayal is. So the question or the comparative is this: if this person being called a monster, and this to deal with like Shari's PR as well in case it comes out of it, if calling that person a monster does not convince you that you cannot just blame does not convince you that what he has done was incredibly evil, then blaming circumstances most definitely won't result in the kind of impact that you wanted to talk about, where individuals are able to introspect and therefore believe that everyone was part of the problem. Because I think that the way to reach out to individuals must always be in the form of absolutes, because that's the easiest way and the best way to be able to convince them of a particular problem. No, thank you. Rather than simply continuing to talk in abstractions or continue to talk about things like spectrums, because the world is an infinitely complex place and you can't point out to every single similarity in all the different situations about how exactly this particular evil came to be. What exactly are the impacts of this? Here's how we deal with it. First question, right? As much as we wanted to, so the first thing that we need to point out is that oftentimes calling someone evil and saying that what they did was inexcusable allows for the filtration of this particular narrative towards the way that the individual on the ground view the issue as well. So if you look at Germany as a good example, for instance, the fact that what Hitler did was seen to be inexcusable is literally one of the reasons why a cornerstone of their textbook has always been trying to avoid the idea of allowing this evil to happen, to recognize the responsibility that they've been complicit in allowing the evil to take power. That's the reason why Germany, for example, is able to do, or are willing to do things like give out reparations to individuals because of that precise idea that they feel as if it's inexcusable and unjustifiable what they have done. But secondly, I would also argue that this particular portrayal of evil is especially important when it comes to the recognition of how people view this act to begin with. The idea that we must draw these standards at the end of the day and show why this is an issue. So for example, the TRCs that happened in Cambodia did show that Pol Pot was a monster, but it also showed, and it's not mutually exclusive, right? Because as much as they showed Pol Pot as being a monster, they also had to analyze the situations and circumstances in which this one individual was able to wrestle so much power at the end of the day to be able to commit the kind of acts that he did at the end of the day. So I don't think that is the dichotomy that they are drawing in this debate. But the question of the debate therefore must be, how then do we get people to react viscerally to the idea of tragedies that exist in our day-to-day life, and how exactly do we, or what kind of label do we want to attach to these individuals when it comes to dealing with them in our portrayal in history? We argue that the idea that we can show that history has allowed for these monsters, despite the fact, or despite the idea that most people don't think of themselves as monsters, to be able to ascend to power so many times, means that it makes people more likely to be afraid and makes people more likely to be aware of when they are being complicit with evil. We're happy to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. To begin the closing half, I'd like to call upon the member of government.
Oh, we go like it's okay. Very good. Close. Testing. Yeah. The Sunni community of Iraq had been deprived of rights because Sunni Saddam was called a monster. The white villagers in South Africa have been deprived of rights because white colonialists have been painted as fully evil. The ethnic Khmer in Cambodia have been trampled because Khmer Pol Pot was painted as exclusively a monstrosity. The painting of history's villains as inhumane beings have halted post-conflict societies from reaching the heights of comfort that we currently enjoy today. OG addressed structural reasons why they get far better on their side of the house. Opening opposition's problem is historical revisionism and how they want to get people to react viscerally without ever addressing how their visceral reaction could possibly be bad. CG will enter this debate by telling you how minorities are painted as monsters, especially important in post-conflict societies. Two things done in my speech. Why the sins of historical revisionism is fowls under their side of the house, and secondly, our extension as to how the demonization of villains as monsters spills onto oppressed minorities. So what? On this, no thank you. Why on the sins of historical revisionism? So I would actually say, right, that you actually give far more ammunition to apologists at the point at which you paint these people as fully evil. Two reasons why. One, recognize that the same apologists that they want to cater for on the other side of the house are also the ones who are far more likely to be defensive and seek reparation for the same villains that they care about. Because when you paint someone as inherently inhumane, when you paint someone as a monstrosity, that's precisely the point at which these individuals feel as if they sympathize with this villain who is painted as inherently bad to begin with. But secondly, right, recognize that this is like kind of stupid tagging, but it's far easier for apologists to apologize.
It simply isn't believable that someone is inherently evil. Apologists are able to garner far more support for the precise historical villains that they want to cater for, because it is the majority public already don't believe that someone could possibly encapsulate what evil is. The comparative is outside the house when you paint these people as rash as human beings who did have like goals and interests and etc. That's precisely the point in which apologists are unable to tap into that same form of rhetoric. I'll take opening.
So NIF says that unless you not label them as monsters, people won't realize that anyone could be capable of evil. But closing says that they already realize this, so calling them monsters makes it worse. Which is it?
Could you what?
So
I'm an obvious one.
You say that people are already aware of the fact that these individuals are not actually monsters, and therefore if you call them a monster, they will sympathize with this person. Whereas Liv says, unless you stop labeling them as monsters, they won't realize that these individuals were not monsters in the first place.
I just don't understand, right? Because at the point at which you paint these individuals as monsters, you're far more likely for these people to buy into the rhetoric. I just don't get the POI. Maybe should I address it, right? Okay, so, extension, how the demonization of villains as monsters spills onto minorities. Recognize that in post-conflict societies, dictators get into power by ethnic lines. They pander to racial lines and what happens is that individuals on the ground associate ethnic identities with the villains that you demonize. What do I mean by this? No, thank you. Hitler pandered to the white Aryan race as individuals who got him into power to begin with. Pol Pot pandered to ethnic Khmer individuals to get into power to begin with. Shia leaders like Ayatollah, for instance, also pandered to Shia individuals on the ground. They appealed to racial lines to get into power to begin with. Why is this bad? It's bad because recognize that a conflation of that minority group and the villain that they also paint as monsters becomes exactly the same. The same ethnic, because recognize that these individuals came from the same ethnic backgrounds as these minority communities, for instance. But I'll give you two more reasons, one really good reason why as well. The individuals who write history books tend to be the individuals who end up being the victorious side. This means that one, there's an incentive to appease majority populations insofar as that is the case. But two, there's also an incentive to demonize these individuals as overtly inhumane. What does this mean? It means that you paint these individuals as coming from those ethnic communities, and those ethnic communities bear the same sins as their villains, as these dictators. No, thank you, I'm not taking anymore. What is this like? What is incredibly bad, right? Because recognize this is particularly important when post-conflict societies where dictators are toppled from power. What happens? One, some minority communities are actively blamed for the dictator's rise to begin with. They are never given representation. They are actively painted as the individuals who condemned us to this undemocratic form of government. The Sunni, currently under the status quo, have to bend backward for the Alawites in Syria precisely because they were blamed for the same cause. But two, also understand that in post-conflict societies, rebel groups are able to cling on to power. What do I mean by this? They are able to use the exact same rhetoric that if I were to leave, that if I were to be restricted from government, the same supporters of the evil monster of the dictator will steal your land. The same supporters will oppress you. The same supporters will trample your rights. What is then the comparative, right? Two things. One, understand that the point at which you see ethnic minorities as human, primarily because of their extension as the historical figure as human as well, is precisely the point at which you accept that these individuals voted for Hitler, voted for Pol Pot, precisely because of the structural reasons and policies that Pol Pot catered for to begin with. That is the comparative opposition side has to defend in this particular debate. Why is this argument so important, and why does CG take the debate? Recognize that this conflation is precisely what leads to minority communities who are to be oppressed under the status quo to begin with, right? So two very important things. One, they're never given democratic representation in these countries. No longer are people able to justify giving quotas to these individuals. No longer able to justify ensuring that they have a place in parliament. Sunnis in Iraq currently don't have a place precisely because of the sins of Saddam Hussein. The comparative is that they're outside of the house. When you recognize that these individuals were not part of the evil, for instance, when you recognize that they're not part of the monstrosity that exists, that's when you allow them to have some sort of say. But secondly, also understand that you're far more likely to exacerbate the sort of ethnic violence that also exists under the status quo toward the same communities. Individuals are able to justify the persecution of ethnic Khmers, the raping of little girls, the murdering of little boys, precisely because they came from the same ethnic background as that particular villain. They're regarded as spawned of that monstrosity, and we think that's incredibly, incredibly bad. The comparativists on the outside the house, you recognize that these individuals are human. You recognize that these individuals are essentially the same being as you, who don't necessarily condone for their evil, but were pushed precisely because of the structural inequalities. That is the benefit that we get on the outside the house, and opening a CO hopefully gets to address that, right? Sunnis don't bear the sins of Saddam Hussein. Caucasians don't bear the sins of white colonialists. Ethnic Serbs don't bear the sins of Serbian leaders. So proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government, for his speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Member of Opposition.
Hello, hello.
Just a little bit.
Khalis wants the Sunni Muslims to be absolved of Saddam Hussein's sins. But in order for them to get representation, in order for them to be absolved, first, people have to absolve Saddam Hussein's sins first. Now, if OG is still going to paint Saddam Hussein as evil, I'm not sure where this absolution is coming from. Let's deal with a few things. First, let's deal with CG. Now, he talks about how apologists get defensive. Now, again, OG still says they are evil, right? So they will still be defensive. The question is, why would you want to give them more arguments? Because you literally enabled the narrative that that whatever monster it is was a victim of circumstance. It was not his conscious choice to commit those evils. So yeah, your apologies on your side get more arguments. Secondly, he talked about how the majority race gets fucked over and they are blamed for being the same race as the monster. So firstly, that assumes that the majority were the victims, right? But how do you reconcile that with your own premise that the monsters were usually voted in by the majority? Let's deal with OG first. We have talked about how you are able to then analyze the root of the problem, right? You are able to analyze the structural things that created the monster, right? But what does this mean, right? This means you allow supporters, you allow apologists to shift the blame, right? Because the narrative surrounding the evil that we created becomes a narrative that he was a product of some Stalin. It was not a conscious choice of him becoming evil. You allow Nazis to literally defend Hitler's Nazism because they get blamed on the failure of negotiations, they get blamed on the failure of the economy, they get blamed on Jews. You allow to blame him on external things, not his own choice. You allow his injustice by the victim. You get research analysis, about this on my explanation, and I'll send you right now. But we believe that minority usually fuck over educated. And the thing is, the majority are the ones who want to control the narrative. So when you don't label them as monsters, it means that the majority are able to defend the monsters. They are able to defend the monsters because it gives them even able to do so. So we need to give the minority something extra, something better that will allow them access to the discourse. Yeah, okay. Opening. So I'm not sure how you think that 6 million people in the country schools were voted in history, especially when we discuss it. But you must tell us what are the majority fighting Yeah, so it's about a comparative, right? Which is more likely to be forgotten. And I'll tell you about that later. Firstly, I'll talk to you about humanizing versus dehumanizing, what happens then. Secondly, I'll talk about the social capital and why it's more likely that the atrocities will be forgotten. So what happens when you humanize a dictator, right? Sit down. You give credence to the utilitarian goals of dictators, of the villains, right? For example, Hitler eradicating Jews, and he argued that, yeah, they fucked over the economy, they betrayed Germany, and stuff like that. So you allow this kind of narrative to happen. You give credence to those arguments. Secondly, you give a reason to an unreasonable evil, right? You allow people, apologists, to rationalize the evil and to justify the atrocity that they committed. So what happens is there's less condemnation of evil and, well, you enable the apologists. Secondly, what does painting as monsters do, right? That means you have more analysis academically. Sit down. What do I mean? So at a point in which you humanize them, you paint them as ordinary people who do ordinary things, who paint, who has dogs, who likes animals, that kind of thing. So you lose the sense that makes them interesting, right? You lose the sense of them being sellable. So what happens is this: you discourage you discourage books that they are published, right? You discourage books and documentaries to be published when they lose the sense of being special, being especially evil and stuff like that. You paint them as ordinary. Ordinary doesn't sell. So what does this mean? This means that we have more social capital when there's interest, and this means that we have more academic research, more detailed psychoanalysis, because there is a profit incentive for people to do so. That means we are better able to deconstruct the evil atrocities committed on our side. What does this course look like, right? Sit down. We tell you that we are able to have a more academic narrative versus on your side, people constantly looking for the good in people, right? That's why it's so hard to vilify objectively evil people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi's atrocities, right? Because people latch on to a very few good things that they saw and that they recognize, and because they don't want to be proven like they are wrong, right, about them being good. So how does this disallow atrocities from being forgotten? A, at the point in which these monsters become ordinary, where is the capital to continue publishing books, documentaries that condemn him going to come from? So we tell you that they are more likely on your side to be washed away by time. The atrocities are more likely to be forgotten. B, if there's opposition coming from the apologists that are enabled by your narrative, that these monsters have their justifications, these monsters are ordinary people who are victims of their circumstances. This means publishers are less likely to publish history textbooks that focus on the atrocities. They are less likely to be psychoanalysis on such evil because there are people actively opposing them. That means there are less condemnation of monsters, there's less continued vilification of them. It's easier to forget the atrocities it's very unjust. So if you accept the premise that victims need justice, if you accept that justice is lost when atrocities are forgotten, you accept that justice is lost when people tell you that your oppressor was a good ordinary man with good intentions, he does good things sometimes, and he committed these atrocities because he was a victim of circumstance. That means you humanize monsters and you disallow victims from accessing justice because you enable apologists, you enable people to forget the atrocities that this monster committed. I'm very, very proud to focus.
Thank you, Member of Opposition, for its speech. To conclude the government case, I'd like to call upon the government to begin it.
When I was in Cambodia and we saw the War Museum, post taking down of Pol Pot, there were a lot of slaughters and killings of ethnic Cambodians. When I asked why, right, you know what he said? He said, paying for the crimes of the monster that is Pol Pot. That is exactly what individuals on the ground do in post-conflict society. When they feel that those individuals were nothing but monsters, when they continuously conflict those ethnic lines with their leaders. I think it's incredibly problematic that CO did not respond to our case, and we need to make sure that they do that in Kelvin. All right, let's look at a few things. Number one, they said, what am I going to do first of all? First of all, I'm going to have a couple of responses towards their extension about like it's less interesting. I don't know how like this becomes more interesting. But secondly, I'm going to talk about how what opening opposition talked about, which side necessarily gets better discourse, and particularly I'm going to nuance that to why that's extremely important within the post-conflict societies. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why the conflation of ethnic communities spills over to minority communities, and why that really wins us the debate. So a few things, right? Number one, CG said that those individuals won't get defensive because they'll still be painted as evil. Again, it's a comparative, right? If we don't paint them as monsters, they're less likely to get defensive on the same way that you do so. China is more likely to engage with you on a discussion because they don't feel like you just called their leader monsters. We continuously make sure that those individuals are dealt with. I also think that secondly, there's necessarily a difference between ad hominem and facts to begin with, right? Monster is a useless label that tells us about the cult of personality or the personality surrounding that individual to begin with. It doesn't tell us the facts surrounding what that individual necessarily did to begin with. Secondly, they said, guys, your extension, sit down. Your extension means two things. It means that it allows you to absolve Saddam Hussein's sins. I don't understand why this is about absolving Saddam Hussein's sins, particularly when, number one, we told you it's about dealing with the facts of Saddam Hussein's case and making it so that when we say monster, individuals don't immediately associate that to the ethnic communities and the ethnic ideas on the ground. But understand, right, that within these communities, there are oftentimes many conflicting interests, right? So there aren't these strict majorities that they necessarily want to talk about. There are also Sunnis, there are Shias, there are different balances of power that we necessarily need to get into. So I think these glib responses don't necessarily make sense. The last thing that I will say in response to CG about their response about being less interesting is I think this is a very marginal extension at best. Number one, the kind of people who go into history are not because they're interested in Hitler being a monster, for example. These are people who dedicate their entire lives to this. We want the people who are actually in it to be in it to begin with. But maybe he's talking about people as a whole. I think it's incredibly harmful. Sit down. I think you play into all the harms that Khalis necessarily talked about at the point where you make it about being interesting and about the immediate conflation is that these individuals were necessarily monsters to begin with. I think that CG dealt with. Let's deal with CO dealt with. Let's deal with opening opposition. Before that, yes, Adil.
If you didn't call Pol Pot a monster, would it have been so possible for Cambodians to forgive the other members of his regime in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions?
But that's the entire point of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not to call people monsters, right? If you're telling me that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission necessarily happened to begin with, that means that it was effective in getting reparations back towards these other individuals. All right, second, what kind of discourse do we necessarily get? There are two things that I'm going to prove under our case. Number one, the kind of discourse that we get is far more believable. And secondly, the kind of discourse that we get is far more likely to be accepted. Let's look at the few things that opening opposition told you about. Number one, they told you about the visceral impact of evil. There's two things that they want. There's two structural reasons that I'm going to give here as a rebuttal, right? Number one, I think that the visceral impact of evil actually, and calling them monsters, make it more difficult for individuals to buy into this. Why is that? It's because individuals are biased towards themselves and their own communities. Malaysians think Malaysia is great. Cambodians think Cambodia is great, and therefore they're necessarily less likely to buy into it at the point where you call those individuals monsters. But furthermore, what we tell you, secondly, is that it necessarily creates distance between those individuals to begin with. At the point where you call them a monster, these individuals are less likely, or those people on the ground are less likely to buy into that those things are the same things that can be propagated by it. So I don't think we necessarily do want to create a visceral impact of evil. All right, secondly, not giving ammunition towards these apologists to begin with. There's two things, right? First of all, you have to understand how it is that an apologist necessarily apologizes to begin with. So for example, what a Nazi sympathizer necessarily says is that he says that it wasn't really 6 million Jews who who died in the first place. They attempt to downplay it. They say that it's unbelievable that a monster or that this person was a monster that necessarily was created to begin with. I think that OG gave you some analysis, but I'm going to extend it even more. Number one, the way in which I will extend it is that I think that this leads towards other individuals, or it gives them far more ammunition under their side, because the apologists are able to say that it's necessarily something that's unbelievable. They're able to weaponize that rhetoric. But second of all, I think that because they make those individuals far more defensive, it's less likely to be accepted on the ground, because other individuals are more likely to call it out, right? So they appeal towards the emotions of those people on the ground. The third thing they told us was that they said, guys, we need to call out Winston Churchill as a monster. The reason why it's really unbelievable for me to buy into this argumentation is that, like, just first of all, what incentive does the victor of a war crime have to call their own leader a monster to begin with? It's extremely unbelievable to me that you're going to get these people being called as monsters. I think that the alternative is more true, that they're more likely to analyze their mistakes, and they have more of an incentive to see what exactly the problem is once they don't call these individuals monsters to begin with, precisely because of the structural reasons that I gave you earlier. Last thing in this debate, the conflation of ethnic characteristics and how that spills over to communities. So there's a few things that I want to point out that happened in this debate. First of all, I think the deadlock that happened in opening government and opening opposition happened because kind of both things are true. Opening government said it's structural reasons. Opening opposition said it's up to the individual. Ultimately, we have to understand that both things are necessarily true in this debate, and necessarily what I think is the truest thing in this debate is how individuals perceive what exactly happens regarding the post-conflict that happens within these communities to begin with, right? So understand that, number one, inside these communities, given the fact that they're oftentimes going towards ethnic tensions to begin with for a very, very long time, these individuals use that to continuously justify rhetoric against slaughters against these individuals to begin with. But the second thing we also told you was that this is exactly how post-conflict societies cling to power. Muammar Gaddafi was a rebel leader who took down his government. He told you that you cannot allow these monsters to get back into power. He painted history as the villains. That's how he clung on to power.
Thank you, Government Whip. To end the grand finals, I'd like to call upon the opposition.
I think the only reason why we remember Hitler today and we go on to talk about Hitler in both the academia field and also just in jest between drawing parallels of Hitler as the noun of evil, the adjective evil, is because we are constantly reminded that he's a monster. It's because that we attach the value of being a monster to him and people remember the fact that he is a monster. It's sort of a chicken and egg scenario. Which one do we get first? We would contend that calling him a monster is key into talking about the nuances and the processes in which he came to be a monster to begin with. Because void of that, people forget, and you forget the reasons why you hate the Sunnis in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Now, let's deal with the nuance in CO first, and then we'll talk about how we are different from OO. The nuance in CG, then we're different from OO, and then I'll talk about how we get structural changes in society and deal with the government bench in general. So they say that Sunnis in Iraq are still demonized because of Saddam Hussein. And if we don't talk about Saddam Hussein in a nice way, then they're going to continue being demonized. Now, the thing Wesley pointed out here is that the problem with the argument is that they are also going to continue calling Saddam Hussein evil because the things that he objectively did was evil, i.e. the chemical attack in Halabja. What this means is that if you associate Sunnis to Saddam Hussein and the same level of evil, then in order to absolve these Sunnis of the sins, then you're going to have to completely absolve Saddam Hussein as well. You're going to continue calling them evil. The second problem with this is that it assumes that the vast majority of atrocities happen to majority communities from minority communities, when the converse is true and the majorities control the popular narrative, the media, the culture, and political power in society. I think that the better discussion on what happened to Saddam happens on our side when we don't forget Saddam. And where the most of the debate happens is instead what the opening government talked about in this debate, right? We go so far as to say that if you forget Saddam, you forget the reasons why you need to forgive the Sunnis, and that animosity just continues for the longest time, if they are truly the minority in your country, right? So the reason why we're different from is because we told you the specific reasons why people will create that structural change, and how people remember, and like the ground level differences in the decision-making process, right? No, thank you. Now, CG told us is that people will write Hitler into history books anyways because historians do that, and people are just historically just that way, right? Look, there is a comparative here. If you are going to paint him as less evil, therefore as less important to be remembered because it's not as key and there are things that absolve him for the things that he did, then there's less of a reason for me to put him into those history books because people don't need to remember it as much. Maybe there were reasons why he did it. Maybe the utilitarian justifications in why he killed the Jews was perhaps justified, and over time in history, we will put less and less of Hitler into history books. And that is a problem, right? Especially if there's no use of Hitler as people's nouns to be the evil. Sure. And also, I think, secondly, you have generally more opposition from your apologists and loyalists. So if I, as an individual, want to go into the field of history, or want to be a psychologist, wants to psychoanalyze how Hitler came to be, at the point in which society tells me that he wasn't that much of a bad person, society tells me that there's no reason to talk about this guy because it's not that bad of a thing to begin with, that's why I'm less likely to put him into my books, write him into my journals, I'm less likely to analyze him within my academic research programs, right? That's why you don't have him to begin with in your popular narratives in society. No, thank you. How do we get the structural changes in society? Now, it is key to remember that the only way, obviously, you get your structural changes, and this I'll concede, is by recognizing the nuances and the process in which Hitler came to power, right? That he was democratic, that he capitalized on populist sentiments in Nazi Germany at that point in time. Government solution to this is obviously you just tell them that nuances and processes, you tell them the humanistic aspect of how Hitler came to be, and the opposition is that you sell them one narrative. Why is selling them that one narrative of him being the monster comparatively better than just telling them the humanistic aspect of it straight away? I'll give opening a chance.
So, at least on the outside, if you still feel the consequences as a result of this villain, you have the natural incentive to continue investigating and learning about this thing for the rest of your life. But you haven't responded to all the structural reasons why people want to abscond from this personal responsibility and spawn this off as something extraordinary.
I will respond to it now. So I think that you will have less of a reason to fix those structural changes to begin with, right? Just to highlight. So the first thing is that we have to realize is that you will also embolden the loyalists who have an extra argument to use to begin with. Your neo-Nazis, your communists who preferred Stalin and Lenin. And it's important to remember that these are individuals who often form the majority, i.e. they are the people who voted Hitler into power to begin with in Nazi Germany, right? So at the point in which the Allied forces and the victorious Western media did not come in and tell you that Hitler was a monster, these are the same majority communities who will want to control the popular narrative and say that we were not that bad, that he wasn't that bad because it would reflect badly upon them, right? So the only way minority communities that are oppressed get access to proper justice is when they have the ability to use the argument that he was a monster, and they capitalize that, and your majorities can't use arguments just out of having control of the political process and the control over the media to begin with, right? I think the victory of the Western media and the Allied forces during the war was very important in creating that narrative to protect the Jewish people, right? Next, what we tell you instead is that when you constantly remind people that Hitler existed to begin with, people will obviously make the link, right, that he was a human being. So I would say so far that if at the point in which you call him a monster, people don't just disassociate him and assume he's a alien person on this planet, right? Like, they won't just completely forget like that he existed as a human like being to begin with. And at this point, that's when they're just likely to remember that Hitler could be among one of us as well. I think that's important to remember in terms of remembering Hitler as well, and the fact that people do not just ignore the fact that Hitler existed just because he did extraordinary things, and they ignore the fact that Hitler can exist today as well. But more importantly, the only way you get structural changes and people remembering to make those structural changes and continue to oppose populist policies, populism that can harm minorities, is that if you continue writing Hitler into history books, and then that's when you get the discussion on Hitler and such dictators as well, right? OG's response is this: wait, how do we forget 6 million people died? Well, how do we not remember that Mao Zedong killed 60 million people? Because the popular narrative in China was that he was a good person and that he brought great economic benefits to China to begin with, right? The converse is more true. And we think that we are more likely to forget these things at the point which you don't remind people that he was a monster, and people don't go into the discussion on why he became a monster to begin with. For all those reasons, we are very, very happy to oppose.